November 23, 1944, Camp Reynolds, Pennsylvania. Katrin Mueller stood frozen in the doorway of the mess hall, her breath catching in her throat. Before her stretched tables covered in white cloth, decorated with autumn leaves and paper turkeys that looked like they'd been crafted by children's hands. But it wasn't the decorations that made her heart pound. It was the food. Platters of golden brown roasted turkey, steam rising from bowls of mashed potatoes, dishes of stuffing that smelled of herbs she couldn't name, crimson cranberry sauce gleaming in the afternoon light, and pies, actual pies, lined up on a side table like treasures from another world. Behind her, 56 other German women pressed forward, their collective gasp filling the cold November air. Sophie Schaefer, the youngest among them at 20 years old, gripped Katrin's arm so tightly it hurt. "This is a trick," Sophie whispered in German, her voice trembling. "It has to be a trick. They're going to poison us." Katrin wanted to believe that, wanted the cynicism that had kept her alive through months of captivity to protect her now. But the smells were real. The steam rising from the food was real. And the expressions on the American guards' faces weren't the looks of executioners. They were something else entirely. Something that looked almost like pride. Captain Helen Morrison stepped forward, her uniform crisp despite the informal nature of the gathering. Her voice was steady and clear as she addressed the assembled prisoners. "Ladies," she began, and Katrin noticed she didn't say prisoners or Germans, just ladies. "Today is Thanksgiving, an American holiday. It's a day when we give thanks for what we have and share our blessings with others. We want to share this tradition with you." Katrin translated quietly for those whose English was limited, stumbling over words she barely understood herself. Thanksgiving? What kind of holiday involved feeding your enemies like honored guests? Hannah Dietrich, standing to Katrin's left, let out a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "They're serious," she muttered. "Mein Gott, they're actually serious." The American soldiers began moving through the room, not with weapons or commands, but with serving spoons and ladles. Corporal James Hartley, the guard from Ohio who had shown Katrin unexpected kindness in recent weeks, approached their group with a platter of turkey. His smile was gentle, almost apologetic. "Please," he said, gesturing toward the tables. "Sit, eat. You're our guests today." That word, guests, broke something inside Katrin. Her vision blurred with tears she'd been holding back for months. Around her, other women were crying too, their shoulders shaking as they stared at the impossible feast before them. They weren't tears of fear or suspicion anymore. They were tears of something far more dangerous, something that threatened every wall Katrin had built around her heart since her capture. They were tears of hope. September 14, 1944, 2 months earlier. The transport truck rumbled through the Pennsylvania countryside, its canvas cover providing little protection from the late summer heat. Katrin Mueller sat pressed between two other women, her gray auxiliary uniform soaked with sweat, her wrists still bearing the marks from the ropes that had bound them during the first days after capture. She tried to count how many days had passed since French resistance fighters had stormed their communications post outside Rouen. 17? 18? Time had blurred into an endless sequence of interrogations, temporary holding cells, and now this final journey to whatever fate awaited them in America. Sophie Schaefer sat across from her, looking impossibly young despite the nurse's insignia on her collar. The girl hadn't spoken in 3 days, not since they'd been loaded onto the ship that brought them across the Atlantic. Her blue eyes stared at nothing, and Katrin wondered what horrors she'd witnessed in the field hospitals before her capture. Hannah Dietrich, older and harder than most of them, sat near the truck's opening, trying to glimpse their surroundings through gaps in the canvas. "We're in the middle of nowhere," Hannah reported in German. "Farms, trees, no cities. They're hiding us away where no one will know we exist." The truck finally stopped, and American voices shouted orders Katrin couldn't fully understand. The canvas flap opened, revealing armed soldiers and, surprisingly, a woman in an American officer's uniform. Captain Helen Morrison stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her expression unreadable as she watched the German women climb down from the truck. Katrin counted 57 of them in total, ranging in age from Sophie's 20 years to a radio operator named Gertrude who claimed to be 41. They formed ragged lines without being told, military training overriding exhaustion and fear. Captain Morrison stepped forward, and when she spoke, her voice carried an unexpected gentleness. "Welcome to Camp Reynolds," she said, and Katrin caught enough English to translate for the others. "You will be housed in barracks, assigned work duties, and treated according to the Geneva Convention. You are prisoners of war, but you are also human beings, and you will be treated as such." The words seemed impossible. Katrin had been taught that Americans were brutal, that they tortured prisoners, and showed no mercy to German soldiers. Yet here was this woman speaking of human dignity and international law. Behind Captain Morrison, Katrin noticed a young soldier watching them with an expression that wasn't hatred or contempt. It was something closer to sadness, maybe even pity. Corporal James Hartley, though Katrin didn't know his name yet, met her eyes for just a moment before looking away. That brief glance contained no malice, no triumph, just a weary recognition that they were all caught in something larger than themselves. As the guards led them toward the barracks, Katrin felt the first crack in her certainty about who her enemies truly were. Corporal James Hartley had every reason to hate Germans. His older brother Michael had died on Omaha Beach 3 months earlier, cut down by machine gun fire before he'd even made it off the landing craft. The telegram had arrived at their family's home in Cincinnati on James's 23rd birthday, transforming what should have been a celebration into a funeral. His mother hadn't stopped wearing black since. His father had stopped speaking about anything that mattered. And James had volunteered for guard duty at prisoner of war camps, thinking that facing the enemy every day would somehow help him make sense of Michael's death. But standing in the September sunshine, watching these exhausted German women stumble off the transport truck, James felt no hatred. He felt tired. He felt sad. And most confusingly, he felt something uncomfortably close to compassion. They looked like his sister's friends back home, like the girls who worked at the factory where he'd assembled aircraft parts before his deployment. Young women who probably hadn't wanted this war any more than Michael had. That first week, James watched the German prisoners carefully, trying to find the monsters he'd been taught to expect. Instead, he saw Sophie Schaefer crying silently in the corner of the recreation yard, her thin shoulders shaking with sobs she tried to hide. He saw Hannah Dietrich organizing the younger women, making sure they understood the camp rules and stayed out of trouble. And he saw Katrin Mueller, the one with intelligent eyes and careful movements, trying to learn English by listening to every conversation between guards. On the 4th day, James was walking patrol near the barracks when he noticed Katrin struggling with a heavy bucket of water. She was trying to fill the washing basins alone, her arms trembling with effort. Without thinking, James stepped forward and took the bucket from her hands. "Let me help," he said, then realized she probably didn't understand. But Katrin's eyes widened with something that looked like fear. She stepped back, clearly expecting punishment for accepting assistance from a guard. James slowly carried the bucket to the washing station and set it down, then stepped away with his hands visible. "It's okay," he said softly. "Just trying to help." Katrin studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she did something unexpected. She nodded slightly and said in heavily accented English, "Thank you." Those 2 words, spoken with such careful pronunciation, hit James harder than any propaganda poster ever had. She was trying. Despite everything, despite being a prisoner in an enemy country, despite having every reason to remain silent and hostile, she was trying to communicate, to connect, to be more than just a faceless enemy. That night, James wrote to his mother for the WWII, first time since Michael's death. He didn't mention the German prisoners directly, but he wrote something he hadn't been able to say before. "Maybe," he wrote, "we have to find ways to be better than this war wants us to be. Maybe that's how we honor the people we've lost." October brought the first Red Cross mail delivery to Camp Reynolds. Captain Morrison announced it during morning assembly, and Katrin watched as hope flared across the faces of her fellow prisoners like matches struck in darkness. For 6 weeks, they had existed in a strange void, cut off from everyone and everything they had known. Now, finally, they might learn if their families still lived, if their homes still stood, if there was anything left of the world they remembered. The letters arrived in a canvas mail sack, and Captain Morrison called names one by one. Each woman who received an envelope clutched it like a sacred object, retreating to private corners to read words from home. But as minutes passed, Katrin noticed something terrible. Only 17 women had received letters. 40 of them, including herself, stood empty-handed, facing the crushing possibility that no one had written because no one remained alive to write. Sophie Schaefer was among those who received mail. The young nurse tore open her envelope with shaking hands, her eyes scanning the cramped handwriting. Then her face crumpled. She sank to the ground, the letter falling from her fingers, and released a sound that Katrin would hear in her nightmares for years to come. A wail of pure anguish that contained no words, only grief too vast for language. Hannah Dietrich picked up the fallen letter and read it aloud to those gathered around. Sophie's mother wrote that her father had been killed in an air raid on Nuremberg. Her younger brother, only 15 years old, had been conscripted into the Volkssturm and was missing somewhere on the Eastern Front. Their apartment building no longer existed. Her mother was living in a church basement with 11 other displaced families, surviving on ration cards that provided barely enough food to keep her alive. The letter ended with a plea that shattered what remained of Sophie's composure. "Please," her mother had written, "if you can stay in America, stay. There is nothing left for you here but hunger and ruins." Across the barracks, other letters revealed similar horrors. Gertrude learned that her husband had died in a Soviet prison camp. Inga discovered that her entire street in Hamburg had been reduced to rubble by British bombers. Maria's letter contained a single devastating sentence from a neighbor. "Your family's house took a direct hit during the January raids. I'm sorry." The women who had received no letters faced their own torment. Was silence better or worse than confirmation of loss? Katrin found herself staring at the empty space where her name should have been called, trying to imagine her parents' apartment in Stuttgart. Were they alive and unable to reach her? Dead and unable to write? Or had they disowned her for being captured, for bringing shame to the family name? Corporal Hartley stood near the doorway, watching the scene with visible distress. Katrin saw him turn away, his jaw clenched tight, his hands curled into fists. Later, she would learn that he had approached Captain Morrison that evening with a request that seemed impossible. These women had lost everything. Couldn't America show them that not everything in the world was about loss and destruction? Captain Helen Morrison sat behind her desk, rubbing her temples as she reviewed supply requisitions and incident reports. The stack of papers seemed endless, each one a reminder of the 100 small decisions required to run even a small prisoner of war facility. When Corporal Hartley knocked on her office door that evening in late October, she almost sent him away. But something in his expression, a mixture of determination and uncertainty, made her gesture for him to enter. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am," Hartley said, standing at attention. Morrison nodded, curious now. The young corporal had proven himself reliable and compassionate in his duties, qualities she valued highly in guards assigned to female prisoners. "I've been thinking about Thanksgiving," Hartley began, and Morrison raised an eyebrow. "It's coming up in a few weeks, and I know we're supposed to give the prisoners a special meal, but I was wondering if—" he paused, gathering courage, "if we could give them a real Thanksgiving, the full tradition, turkey, stuffing, all of it, like they were family." Morrison leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. "Corporal," she said, slowly, "these women are enemy prisoners of war. We're required to feed them adequately according to the Geneva Convention, but a full Thanksgiving feast? That would require resources, coordination with the supply depot, approval from higher command, not to mention the questions it would raise. Why should we spend that kind of effort on German soldiers?" Hartley's jaw tightened, but he held her gaze. "Because they're not soldiers anymore, ma'am. They're just people who've lost everything. I've watched them read letters from home, or worse, not receive any letters at all. They're grieving and alone and—" he hesitated, "and so are we, if we're honest. Maybe showing them kindness isn't about what they deserve. Maybe it's about who we want to be." The words hung in the air between them. Morrison thought about her own grandmother, who had emigrated from Bavaria in 1898, who had faced discrimination and suspicion during the First World War simply because of her accent. She thought about the easy path of hatred and the harder path of maintaining humanity in the midst of inhumanity. "You're asking me to go out on a limb, Corporal," Morrison said quietly. "If word gets out that we're giving German prisoners a feast while American families are dealing with rationing, there will be consequences. I know the risks." Morrison stood and walked to her window, looking out over the compound where German women moved through their evening routines. She saw Katrin helping Sophie with laundry, saw Hannah organizing a group to sweep the barracks, saw ordinary human moments that transcended nationality and uniform. "These women didn't plan this war," Morrison said, more to herself than to Hartley. "They didn't ask to be here, and neither did we." She turned back to face him. "All right, Corporal. I'll approve it. But this stays quiet until the day itself. No advance warning. And if anyone asks why, I'll tell them the truth. Because Americans don't let hunger and loss have the final word, not even for our enemies." Hartley's face broke into the first genuine smile Morrison had seen from him in weeks. "Thank you, ma'am. You won't regret this." Morrison hoped he was right. The changes began subtly, almost imperceptibly, in the days leading up to Thanksgiving. Katrin noticed them first because she had made it her survival strategy to notice everything. The kitchen staff started working longer hours, the smell of baking bread wafting through the compound at unusual times. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, the kitchen supervisor, made multiple trips to the supply depot, returning with crates whose contents remained hidden under canvas tarps. The guards seemed different too, exchanging knowing glances and suppressing smiles when the German prisoners asked questions. On November 20th, 3 days before Thanksgiving, the tension in the barracks reached a breaking point. Hannah Dietrich called an informal meeting after evening roll call, gathering the women in hushed clusters. "Something is happening," Hannah said in German, her pragmatic voice carrying an edge of worry. "They're preparing something, and they won't tell us what. The Americans are acting strange, bringing in supplies, working in secret. We need to be ready." "Ready for what?" Sophie asked, her voice small and frightened. She had barely recovered from the devastating letter about her family and now faced new uncertainty with visible dread. Gertrude, the oldest among them, spoke what many were thinking. "Maybe they've decided we're too much trouble to keep. Maybe this is the end." Her words sent a ripple of fear through the group. Katrin wanted to dismiss such thoughts as paranoia, but she couldn't. They were prisoners in an enemy country, completely at the mercy of their captors' decisions. Strange preparations could mean anything. Relocation to a harsher facility, repatriation to a Germany that lay in ruins, or something worse that no one wanted to name aloud. Inge, who worked in the laundry and often overheard guard conversations, added fuel to the speculation. "I heard Corporal Hartley talking to Private Wilson yesterday. He said something about Thursday being important, that everything had to be perfect. What if they're fattening us up?" Maria whispered, her voice breaking. Like animals before slaughter?" The idea seemed absurd, but fear made everything seem possible. These were women who had witnessed the collapse of everything they believed in, who had learned that the world could be far crueler than they had imagined. Katrin lay awake that night on her narrow cot, listening to the sounds of other women crying or praying softly in the darkness. She thought about Corporal Hartley, about the genuine kindness in his eyes when he had helped her with the water bucket. She thought about Captain Morrison's measured fairness, about the medical care they had received when Sophie fell ill with fever, about the small mercies that had characterized their captivity. But she also thought about the propaganda she had been taught, about enemy nations capable of any atrocity, and she couldn't fully silence the voice of doubt. On November 22nd, the day before Thanksgiving, the mess hall was closed for cleaning and preparation. The German women were given cold rations in their barracks and forbidden from approaching the building. Through the windows, they could see shadows moving inside, could smell rich aromas that seemed impossible given wartime rationing. Whatever was coming would arrive tomorrow, and 57 women waited in an agony of uncertainty, hoping for mercy, but preparing their hearts for anything. November 23, 1944. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and clear. The Pennsylvania sky, a brilliant blue that seemed to mock the anxiety churning in Katrin's stomach. The German women were assembled outside the mess hall at 1100 hours, earlier than their usual lunchtime. They stood in formation, their worn auxiliary uniforms pressed as neatly as possible, their faces masks of controlled fear. Whatever was about to happen, they would face it with dignity. Captain Morrison emerged from the mess hall, and Katrin noticed something different about her expression. It wasn't the usual professional neutrality, but something warmer, almost excited. Behind her, Corporal Hartley and several other guards positioned themselves near the entrance. "Ladies," Morrison began, and again Katrin noted that word, ladies, not prisoners. "Today is Thanksgiving, an American tradition dating back nearly 300 years. It's a day when we gather to give thanks and to share what we have with others, including those far from home. We invite you to join us in this celebration." The doors to the mess hall opened, and Katrin felt her breath stop in her chest. The transformation was impossible, miraculous. Tables covered in white cloth stretched across the room, decorated with autumn leaves, small gourds, and paper decorations clearly made by children. But it was the food that broke something fundamental inside her. Platters of golden roasted turkey, their skin glistening, mountains of mashed potatoes with butter melting in yellow pools, bowls of stuffing that smelled of sage and herbs, cranberry sauce gleaming like rubies, green beans, rolls, corn, and on a side table, an entire row of pies, pumpkin and apple, their crusts perfectly browned. Behind Katrin, someone made a sound between a gasp and a sob. Then another woman, then another. Within seconds, tears were streaming down faces, women's hands covering their mouths in shock and disbelief. Sophie Scheffer collapsed to her knees, her thin body shaking with sobs. "This cannot be real," Hannah whispered in German, her usual composure shattered. "This cannot be real." Katrin felt her own vision blur as tears spilled down her cheeks. For months, they had survived on adequate but plain rations. Bread, soup, occasional vegetables, meat, maybe twice a week. They had been fed sufficiently according to military regulations, nothing more. And now this abundance, this generosity. This impossible feast laid before them as if they were honored guests rather than captured enemies. Corporal Hartley stepped forward, his eyes bright with emotion. "Please," he said gently, gesturing toward the tables. "Please sit. Share this meal with us. It's what Thanksgiving means, sharing what we have with everyone at our table." The German women moved forward slowly, dreamlike, unable to process what was happening. Katrin found herself seated at a table, staring at a plate being filled by Sergeant Rodriguez, who smiled at her with genuine warmth. The first bite of turkey, tender and seasoned with flavors Katrin had almost forgotten existed, released something in her that she had been holding locked away since her capture. Not just hunger, but hope. The dangerous, terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, humanity could still exist even in the middle of war. The initial shock gave way to hesitant acceptance as American guards moved through the mess hall, not with authority or distance, but with serving spoons and genuine smiles. Corporal Hartley approached Katrin's table carrying a bowl of cranberry sauce. He spooned some onto her plate and noticed her confused expression as she stared at the red gelatinous substance. "It's cranberry sauce," he explained slowly, using simple English words. "Sweet and tart. You eat it with the turkey. Like this." He demonstrated by taking a small amount on his fork with a piece of turkey. Katrin mimicked his actions, the combination of flavors foreign but surprisingly pleasant on her tongue. Across the table, Sophie sat between Nurse Lieutenant Dorothy Hayes and Private Wilson. Hayes was showing Sophie how to make what she called the perfect Thanksgiving bite. A forkful containing turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce all together. Sophie's face, which had been frozen in disbelief since entering the hall, began to soften. She took the bite Hayes had prepared and closed her eyes, and for just a moment, she looked like the 20-year-old girl she was supposed to be, not the haunted young woman war had created. "This is good," Sophie said in careful English, and Hayes beamed at her like a proud teacher. Hannah Dietrich, seated near Captain Morrison, asked the question many were thinking. "Why?" she said, in her accented English, gesturing at the feast around them. "Why do this for us? We are your enemies." Morrison set down her fork and met Hannah's gaze directly. "Because," the captain said, "this is what we believe in. Not just defeating our enemies, but showing them what we're fighting for. Freedom, dignity, the idea that every person deserves to be treated with humanity. If we lose that, we lose everything that makes America worth defending. The words settled over the room, like a benediction. Conversations began to flow more freely, a mixture of broken English, gestures, and occasional German phrases that the guards had learned. Sergeant Rodriguez explained the history of Thanksgiving to a group of fascinated women, describing pilgrims and Native Americans coming together despite their differences. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but it also wasn't dismissed. It was exactly the point. Private Wilson taught Gertrude how to identify different spices in the stuffing. Corporal Hartley helped Anna understand why Americans ate sweet potatoes with marshmallows, admitting with a laugh that he didn't fully understand it either. As the meal progressed, something remarkable happened. Laughter. Actual laughter began to echo through the mess hall. A German woman made a joke about her awkward attempt to cut the turkey. An American guard shared a story about his grandmother's disastrous first Thanksgiving pie. The barriers of language and nationality didn't disappear, but they became less important than the simple human act of sharing a meal. Katrin looked around the room and realized she was witnessing something she had thought impossible. Former enemies becoming, if not quite friends, then at least fellow human beings recognizing each other's humanity. When dessert was served, pumpkin pie with fresh cream, many of the German women wept again. But these tears were different from the morning's shock. These were tears of gratitude, of connection, of understanding that perhaps the world wasn't entirely consumed by hatred after all. The days following Thanksgiving brought unexpected consequences. Word of the feast had leaked beyond Camp Reynolds's fences, carried by supply truck drivers and civilian contractors who had witnessed the unprecedented dinner. Within a week, the story appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer under the headline, "Nazi Prisoners Feast, While American Boys Fight." The article was inflammatory, questioning why enemy combatants received special treatment when American families were enduring rationing and sacrifice. Letters poured into the War Department, some outraged, demanding investigations and punishment for whoever had authorized such excess. Captain Morrison was summoned to headquarters in Washington to explain her decision. Before she left, she gathered the guards who had participated in the Thanksgiving meal. "I don't regret what we did," she told them, her voice steady despite the uncertainty of her future. "And I won't let anyone blame you for following my orders. What we did was right, regardless of the consequences." Katrin watched Morrison's departure with a sinking heart, understanding that the captain might be sacrificing her career for a single act of kindness. The German prisoners held their own meeting that evening, discussing whether they should write letters defending Morrison's actions, though none of them knew if such letters would help or harm her case further. But the story didn't end with condemnation. Other newspapers picked up the account, framing it differently. The Boston Globe ran an editorial titled, "Teaching Democracy Through Action," arguing that America's strength lay not in matching enemy cruelty, but in demonstrating superior values. Church groups across Pennsylvania organized letter-writing campaigns supporting Morrison's decision. Reverend Matthews from a nearby town visited the camp, bringing donations of clothing and books for the German prisoners, and praising the dinner as an example of Christian charity in action. The National Council of Churches issued a statement commending the gesture as consistent with American principles of human dignity. Most surprisingly, letters began arriving at Camp Reynolds from American families who had lost sons in the war. A mother from Pittsburgh wrote, "My boy died at Anzio. But he died believing America stood for something better than revenge. What you did at Thanksgiving, that's what he died defending." A father from Ohio sent a letter saying, "My son would have approved. He always said the way to win a war is to prove you're fighting for something worth preserving." These letters, powerful in their forgiveness and their understanding, were read aloud to both guards and prisoners, creating moments of shared emotion that transcended the boundaries of nationality. Inside Camp Reynolds, the relationships between guards and prisoners deepened, irreversibly. Katrin began teaching formal German classes to interested American personnel, while Corporal Hartley organized English lessons for the prisoners. Sophie, working alongside Nurse Hayes, discovered that her trauma could become purpose, that helping others heal helped her heal as well. Hannah started a small garden project, planting vegetables for the spring, an act of hope that assumed they would all still be there to harvest what they planted. The Thanksgiving dinner had cracked open a door that no amount of military regulation could close again, revealing the possibility that even in wartime, human connection could flourish in the most unlikely places. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally over. At Camp Reynolds, the announcement was met with complex emotions. American guards celebrated with relief and joy, while German prisoners faced the reality of returning to a homeland that existed now, only in ruins and memories. Captain Morrison called a final assembly to discuss repatriation procedures, but her words carried an unexpected message. The processing would take months, and during that time, prisoners could apply for immigration status if they wished to remain in America. Several women, including Katrin, Sophie, and Hannah, submitted formal requests. Katrin's application was sponsored by the Henderson family from Harrisburg, who had visited the camp after reading about the Thanksgiving dinner. Mrs. Henderson, a schoolteacher, saw in Katrin someone who could bridge two worlds. Sophie's path led to medical training in Philadelphia, sponsored by Nurse Hayes, who recognized her gift for healing. Hannah found work with a local greenhouse, her pragmatic skills valued by employers who looked past her uniform to see her character. By October 1945, most prisoners had been repatriated, but 9 women remained, their cases working through immigration channels. November 23, 1945, exactly 1 year after the feast that changed everything. The remaining women gathered with their American sponsors and former guards at a community hall in Harrisburg. This time, they prepared Thanksgiving dinner together, side by side, teaching each other recipes and traditions. Katrin stood to speak before the meal, her English now confident and clear. "Last year," she said, "we sat as prisoners and captors, as enemies learning to see each other as human beings. This year, we sit as friends, as people who chose connection over division." Thanksgiving taught us that gratitude means recognizing what we can become when we choose to feed each other instead of destroying each other. The years that followed proved the power of that choice. Katrin became a translator for the State Department, helping process displaced persons from war-torn Europe. Sophie completed her nursing degree and dedicated her life to caring for others, particularly children. Hannah built a successful landscaping business, never forgetting the garden she had planted at Camp Reynolds as an act of hope. They maintained connections with those who returned to Germany, letters flowing across the Atlantic, creating networks of women united by transformation. When they gathered each Thanksgiving, they brought their children and eventually grandchildren, passing down the story of an impossible feast in a Pennsylvania prison camp. Decades later, when Katrin spoke at the United Nations about reconciliation, she carried the same small diary she had clutched upon arrival at Camp Reynolds. The story of those German women, she told the international audience, wasn't about a single meal. It was about choosing to see humanity in your enemy, about discovering that home isn't where you're from, but where you build a life honoring the best in human nature. The Thanksgiving dinner of 1944 became more than history. It became proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, kindness can transform enemies into friends, prisoners into citizens, and despair into hope. That choice, made in a small camp in Pennsylvania, echoed through generations as a reminder that America's greatest strength lies not in defeating enemies, but in offering them the chance to become something better.